My name is Steve Erb. My hometown is Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I was attending college at Florida State University and passed by the officer recruiting officer, and he had such a good spiel that I decided to join the Marine Corps through the platoon leaders class. And he had these nice shiny wings of gold on, and I said, well, that's for me too. So into the Marine Corps I went in October of 1965 as part of the Marine platoon leaders class with an aviation contract. So I then spent 2 summers at Quantico, and when Florida State was able to give me a degree, I was commissioned that same day, and off to Pensacola I went. I reported into Pensacola, Florida to the Marine Air Detachment at Pensacola Main Side in January of '68, and got my wings in mid-May 1969 with orders to Santa Ana and the 3rd Marine Air Wing, of which I showed up in June, and under the impression that I was going to be out on the West Coast 6 to 7 months. And 3 months later, after a tour in HMM T-302 and HMM 163, I was on my way to Vietnam, reporting into MAG 16 at Marble Mountain in October of '69. Very proud. My grandfather was a Marine. I'm the 2nd Marine in our family. He was a Marine in World War I and served with the Marine Corps in France. My parents were, of course, mixed feelings at the time. I had been married. I got married when I was at halfway through Pensacola, and they were very proud, but I'm sure there was a lot of trepidation on their part, on my wife's part, as far as what was going to go on and what was happening in Vietnam at the time. This was late 1969, October. Lots of questions about what was going on, but it was full support from my family, from both my family's side and my wife's side. Well, I arrived at Vietnam flying in from Okinawa, and I remember, I think we landed at Da Nang at probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and immediately went over to, I think it was Freedom Hill, and put us up in a barracks. And I think about 4 o'clock in the morning, the sirens went off, and I heard these thump, 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 and the next thing I know, I was being told to get out of the rack. We were being mortared. So that was the start. It was either mortar or rockets, I don't remember which. And that was the start of probably some of the greatest experiences I've had in my life. Living conditions in Vietnam, and specifically Marble Mountain, where I spent my whole tour, I would have to say were really above average. For the luck of the draw, I lived in one of the sea hooches, which was not air conditioned, but it was open, it was relatively clean, and I was able to get pretty much of a shower every night. I would have to say my living conditions were so far and above what the grunts did in the field. Pretty much I can almost count on my hand the number of nights that I spent either in an airplane or down at Anhoi or Baldy on missions. But living conditions at Marble were far above average, and a lot better than the grunts had to put up with in Vietnam. Food was edible. And when there wasn't any food at the chow hall, which was rare, I rarely missed a meal there. There was nothing wrong with the sea rats. I can remember my first flight in Vietnam with 364 was with John Harris. John Harris was one of the old salts in 364, had pretty much been everywhere in ICOR and done everything. And after getting into the airplane, trying to figure out how to fold my maps, how to fold a 1 to 50,000 where I could use it, figure out where the FM radio was, and then listen to all the ARTI clearances, I'm thinking to myself, I will never ever be able to handle all this. And is this really something that I'm well equipped to do? But John Harris was a superb pilot, a superb officer. And he walked me through everything. I was able to still log equal number of takeoffs and landings in the zones. The first of a lot of good experiences with John. As the time didn't fly, I think the first couple of missions I flew were pretty easy and controlled, just to get the lay of the land, find out where everything was, get a chance to see where the red ball was. overall good orientation to it. The training that I had had in California, flying on the West Coast, and specifically the training flying the airplanes out in 29 Palms, I thought were as close to the high density altitudes that we ran into in Vietnam. Very, very good training. And the pilots that I flew with initially as an H-2P were some of the best people. I still maintain contact with them, but they were very, very good. I never had the feeling that I was all thumbs, which I was at the time, and that's pretty much, I think, the feeling of most brand new H-2Ps when they come in. But over a succession of time, you get to be more comfortable, you get to know the TAOR and the airplane, and the biggest thing was learning how to fly the airplane in country. The 46 was the backbone of marine aviation, and we flew everything from command and control flights to resupply, to medevac missions, to troop inserts, to recon inserts and extracts, and then there was always the emergency resupplies, the emergency extracts that you had for recon. But it was pretty much, we did everything that required a 46 to support the grunts in Vietnam. When things got a little bit dicey with the challenges, the biggest thing I remember is the great coordination that was required between the pilot and the co-pilot up on the flight deck and the crew chief and the gunners, and a huge amount of connect. Very rarely did I ever see anything where the crew chief and the gunners, where it became chaos in the airplane. And there were some times when the airplanes were shot up. We had aircraft malfunctions. But the biggest thing I remember was the great coordination, especially when you were going in and out of the LZs. If they were hot LZs, the coordination between the crew chief and the pilot, or the co-pilot, depending on who was flying the airplane. And the hot zones, and that could happen at any time. You could be on a basic resupply out in the Quaisans or out in some of the outposts, and you'd take fire when it really wasn't even expected to take fire. But the thing I remember was the great coordination, the high amount of training that crew chiefs had in the airplane, and to be able to communicate to the pilots and get us in and out. Again, a crew chief to me was the absolute, they're the greatest people in the world, because they performed under such adverse conditions. I mean, they'd be working on an airplane for 18 hours a day and then they'd get a few hours sleep. They'd be back in the airplane and we'd be flying missions during the day. I have the highest regard for the training, the esprit de corps that the crew chiefs, the gunners, and the pilots all had. And again, in an airplane with basically 5 crew people on board, 2 pilots, a crew chief, and 2 gunners, the coordination I always thought was just exemplary. As you look back on them, they may not have been funny at the time, but in retrospect, they were pretty funny. I can remember right before I became a hack, flying a resupply mission, and the pilot, and I don't remember who it was at this point, decided that it would be a great test of my aviation skills to turn the SAS off as I was bringing an external load into the Quaisans. And needless to say, I didn't think it was too funny at the time, but the crew chief and the pilot thought it was a wonderful experience to see me chasing chickens and mice around the cockpit of the 46. Okay, let me go back and explain what the SAS on the 46 airplane is. SAS stands for Stability Augmentation System, and that was the hydraulic assist actuators in the airplane that actually controlled the flight control surfaces of the airplane, and it gave you positive feedback and allowed you to really control the flight characteristics of the airplane. When I wasn't flying, I was assigned, I had a number of different assignments in the squadron, from working in S4, which was logistics, to a job I was posted as the assistant S2, which was intelligence, and then I became the S2 for the squadron about halfway through my tour, which I found to be very, very interesting, being able to brief the squadron on all the after-action reports that went on with the other pilots, where we could expect to receive heavy AAA site anti-aircraft from NVA, VC. I also spent a lot of time as in operations as one of the scheduling officers. Fear would be in the fright briefs when we were doing some of the long-range inserts and extracts, and it was more prior to the actual event happening, and then probably more fear after the event occurred. I mean, when you were in support of the grunts and the grunts were under fire, and you're in a save-a-life position, the fear really didn't affect you as much during the time the action was going on as it did either before, and in most cases afterwards. You just had to let your training take over for you in most instances. Saddest memory was the loss of life when we would lose crew either to aircraft mishaps or a crash or a shoot down. That was the toughest part, I think, of my tour, was the loss of life when we'd lose a bird and we'd lose the crew. And in a lot of cases, we'd have to go out to find the crew to see where they were. And I lost my roommate 3 months into my tour on a night mission. He never came back, and we found him and the crew about 2 days later after the incident. And that still stays with me as of today. I can still remember finding the wreckage in the High Band Pass either a day or 2 days after it happened. I think when you're in a combat squadron like we were, you develop very, very close relationships with with a group of pilots, and it develops it's a relationship, and you become friends. But it's also based on respect for their abilities and respect for how they approach and they get a job done. But friendships were formed over in Vietnam, I think, that are lasting for a life. For me, in my case, they've lasted a lifetime. I've stayed in contact with 3 or 4 other members of 364 of the Purple Foxes. Dave Lagab, Bruce Jensen, Hank Lamb. These are people I've known for 45 years. I still maintain contact with them. It's a bond you develop over the course of your life, and you never forget these people. Well, there was always your friendship also developed after hours. Again, we were lucky. We were not like a lot of the grunts in aviation. You were pretty much back at the base at night, unless you were flying night medevac or night missions. So you had a social interaction with members of your squadron. And you developed, you lived with basically 4 or 5 other guys, and you got very, very close to them. You know who they were, where they went to school, who their family was, what their backgrounds were, and it became where your social interaction, then you'd wind up at the O Club with them, having a couple of beers or a couple of drinks after meals, and you discuss the missions of the day, how you handled it, how your crew handled it, the screw-ups that you did, taking too much, not burning off enough fuel before you went into a high LZ with a load, and this was all part of how you got better and better as a pilot and as a Marine officer. Is you never had the feeling you couldn't tell your friends anything that went on. They became your closest friends and your closest confidants, and I think that's why the Marine Corps has been so successful with developing officer, and it's the leadership culture and the ability to rely on people in very, very tough situations. I think my biggest accomplishment, the thing that I brought away from Vietnam with the greatest level of satisfaction and feeling good, was the medevac missions that we did, where you brought wounded Marines that were maybe teetering on whether it was a life, whether they would live or they wouldn't live, and you got them back into the hospitals, into Charlie Med, or out to the sanctuary repose. But it's the feeling that you saved lives by doing what you were trained to do is probably the biggest accomplishment that I thought that we provided to the troops. And again, we were there to support the troops. The troops weren't there for us. We were there to support them, to make sure that they had enough to eat, they had enough to drink, and if they were wounded and they were hurt, that we could get them out of a very tough situation save a life. And that's the thing that I remember the most, is the running the medevac missions. Well, there were two types of night medevacs that we were running, and I'll refer to the first one. First one was called the night medevac, where you had a field grade moon. And I say that somewhat in jest, but again, considering that there weren't too many field grade officers flying 46s because of the mission. But a field grade moon for a night medevac was when there was probably at least a half a moon or a full moon, and you had a better than even chance on a clear night that you could see the LZs. There were a number of those. Those night medevacs were a little bit easier than a dark night on a monsoon night with no horizon and nothing to see when you'd go out, and it was dark. And it was as dark as looking into a well. You relied heavily on it. This was, again, medevac, night medevac. For the most part, during monsoon seasons, you would only go out after emergency medevacs. Emergency medevacs was a life and death situation for the wounded Marine that was in the LZ. And the gunships would go out and lead first, get over the zone, try to get a spot on where the zone was, get a briefing on where we could expect fire from, and run the missions. But again, taking the airplane into the zone, it was almost like trying to land in a dark well, because you really lost all visual references. You relied heavily on your crew chief to walk you into a zone, and you could be shooting the approach to a heat tab or a little bit of lit C4, and if you were lucky, there may be 4 flashlights giving you the size of the LZ, and it was extremely challenging. But you had to do the mission not because you wanted it, but you were really doing it to save a life and to save another Marine, and that drove you above everything. It was a lot of times you would have to wave off. You wouldn't get in on the first approach, whether you lost sight of the zone, or even worse, you took fire and you couldn't get into the zone because of the amount of fire coming up at you to knock you out of the air. A lot of times dictated that you wave off and make your approach from another angle to come in, or another direction, because the fire was so heavy. It was what was called an unsecured zone. It was probably some of the toughest flying we did in Vietnam, was the night medevac. Being a member of 364, flying in the Marine Corps, in I Corps, I have to think that what we did made a difference. I'm truly convinced of that even today. As difficult, as complex as it was, flying within 364 was quite an experience for me. Did it make any impact on the final outcome of the war? That still remains for the historians to figure out. But I have to think that we made a difference. Whether it's saving Marine lives at the time, did it extend the war? Hard to say. There's still, I think the jury is still out on Vietnam, but I think if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't change one thing that I did. I think I made a contribution. I know I made a contribution, as well as did the rest of the members of 364. It was what I consider a very, very elite squadron, because we always got the mission done. What I'd like people to remember about Vietnam was what the young people during this period of time gave to their country. These young men and young women, the nurses, because there was a lot of women that lost their lives in Vietnam. It was done for a purpose. It was done to further the cause of democracy in Southeast Asia. It's very easy to look back into history now and say, well, it didn't accomplish anything. But it does show that you have a responsibility to your country to do. You may not agree with what is going on, but you have a responsibility to perform and to serve your country. And I think those of us that served in Vietnam served this country well, in spite of the political upheavals, all of the problems that went on back in the United States at the time, back in the world, as we used to call it. I never for a second questioned whether the government was right or wrong, but it was a duty a duty you performed because this is what you were asked to do. Mistakes made by the military during the war, I think it was at such a high level above where we were serving. To conduct a war from Washington, D.C., I thought at the time was absolutely ridiculous. Hearing stories that the Air Force pilots that were flying up north into Hanoi and Haiphong were given their targets of opportunity by the politicians in Washington, I thought was a disgrace, being sent up with half bomb loads. These are the guys that have never really received the recognition. And then to be captured if they were shut down, and the years that they spent in captivity, this country can't do enough for those people, as well as for the 57,000 people that lost their lives over there in Vietnam. It's something this country owes a great deal of gratitude to the people that gave their lives. I personally have a lot of still bad feelings, maybe even anger to the politicians granting amnesty to the draft dodgers, the people that didn't want to serve. But to grant amnesty after so many people lost their lives and so many people had their lives affected, it's the people that are still wounded to this day, because these people didn't feel this was something they want to participate in, and they dodged the draft, they went to Canada, they went to Europe or whatever. I mean, that was their choice. But to grant them amnesty and allow them to come back into this country is a burden that this country never should have been put under. Biggest misconception was, and again you can blame possibly the press on this, was the soldiers in Vietnam, whether they were Marines or Army, Navy, Coast Guard, anybody that served in the Army. We were not baby killers. We were not killers of civilians. We were over there to do a job and fight communism. And I think at the end of the day, I think we performed admirably, and certainly with no recognition from home. I think to sum up my time in Vietnam specifically, there's memories I still carry with me today. I remember, there's not a day go by, I don't think of the people, the friends I made, the people I lost. But we did make a difference. We made a difference to the United States and to our country, to our families. We performed in very, very tough conditions. I think I would want people to remember that we served our country well. We performed what we were asked to do, and in my case, if I had it to do over again, I would do the same thing. I think being a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and people question, well, you were a helicopter pilot, wasn't that dangerous? I say yes, but I didn't live in the mud. And I flew into the mud, but the grunts, the Army grunts, the Marine grunts, the people that lived out in the field, there's really, nobody can explain Vietnam to anybody unless you were there. You can look at pictures, you can hear accounts like I'm giving, but you really can't explain what went on in Vietnam unless you were there. I think the same thing probably went on in World War II in the Pacific with the Marines, or the Army in Europe. But in Vietnam, there is certain what it smelled like, what it tasted like, where you were. You can't really describe those conditions or combat to anybody. I haven't seen it done yet. People have come close, but it's an arena that you're put in that you really can't explain it to somebody. There's the mystique, the combat. It's an arena that words really can't describe the conditions in what you're put into. A lot of people don't talk about Vietnam. But I've seen a lot of people don't talk about Korea. A lot of people didn't talk about World War II. But you have to be in combat to really explain or to understand what we went through as Marine pilots during Vietnam, as specifically Marine Corps helicopter pilots. But I would like history to reflect back on our time in Vietnam as we did perform and we did serve our country in a manner that I have no regrets on what I did. I still, every time if I'm getting on an airplane and I smell JP4, I can still smell the airplane starting up for the first time. It was mentioned during, I think, Apocalypse Now, and it's probably the one thing that I still remember is the smell. And the smell of mud will still bring back, if you're out and around. Certain times from medevac missions, there's the smell of death too, that you can still, you remember it. I don't remember it as well, but every once in a while you still get that smell. Sounds, yes, you can still hear the sound. I will never forget what an AK-47 on automatic sounds like. It doesn't sound like an M16. Sound of bullet rounds going through a helicopter, and praying that, God, please don't let anybody in the back be hit by it. Other sounds, B-40 rockets hitting the base, mortars going off. Wounded Marines, even above the whine of the helicopter, these sounds inside, when you've got wounded Marines on board, I can still hear them in pain. Those are some of the sounds that you don't ever forget.